Hello everyone, what's up? In this Star Wars hobby tutorial, I'm going to show you how to paint Star Wars scenery step by step. So if like me, you want to know how to paint 3D printed FDM terrain for your Star Wars Legion games, or maybe you want to know how to apply weathering techniques to a Star Wars diorama, I've got you covered. Before we start, a big shout out to my friends at War Scenery, whom I met at the German War Games convention Hamburger Taktika back in February, and who very kindly sent me this set of buildings already printed. If you like these designs, check out their STLs at warscenery.com. So this is what the buildings look like when I got them. By the way, you might notice a fifth massive building on the left, which is not part of this video. I have other projects in the pipeline right now, but I'll be painting that beast as well in a few months' time. Before we start with painting as such though, it's important to discuss the prepping stage. Now this tower-like building is a really good example. This is what it looked like after prepping and priming. If you have ever painted a spherical FDM print, you'll know that they are particularly difficult, the layer lines being extremely apparent. Now I'm going to show you a sort of side-by-side comparison. On the left you can see a close-up shot from the picture that I took on my bench, and on the right you can see me handle the already prepped and primed building. Now I'm sure you will agree that the difference is like night and day, right? Now for logistical reasons the steps in between took place off camera, but while I show you the other three buildings, I'm going to tell you exactly what I did, so listen closely. First, I sanded all the buildings with a Dremel, using sanding bands. Then I sanded by hand with some flexible sanding sticks. After that, I gave each building, not one but two coats of Mr. Surfacer 500, letting each coat dry before the next. This was followed by two more coats of Mr. Primer Surfacer 1000, and finally by a bit more sanding by hand where I found big defects. Consider this my first secret tip in this video. Mr. Surfacer is not a primer in the traditional sense, but rather a filler in lacquer medium. The number indicates how coarse the filling particles are. For this project, I ended up using 2 rattle cans of each, but they were worth every penny. With the buildings all prepped, I got ready for some intense airbrushing action by changing the needle of my new Gallery Swallowtail airbrush from its regular 0.5mm needle to the largest one, a 0.7 setup. Now the reason for this is that these buildings are obviously much bigger in surface than even the biggest tanks that I paint, so I wanted to ensure maximum coverage and efficiency. My first airbrushing step may surprise you. Yes, another primer yet. This is AK Trax Primer, an acrylic primer which I've used to good effect in the past. Here I'm spraying this with a few drops of AK's own acrylic thinner and at a pressure of about 22 psi. As you can see, I was going very easy on the trigger at first, which with a primer as thick as this would normally be a problem. However, with the Swallowtail's large needle setup, this was a true pleasure to spray. However, you might be wondering why on earth it is that I'm using primer again. Well, there are two reasons. First of all, I wanted the buildings to be gray in the end, and I like painting gray over a sort of dark but at the same time warm undercoat, which this is. You can buy Mr. Surfacer mahogany instead of gray, in fact, but I just didn't have that at hand. Oh, and secondly, these buildings are going to end up in the school club that I run, handled by a horde of excitable kids. And as I'm sure you all know, the top coat on any model is as tough as the primer underneath, so I didn't mind the extra labor in return for peace of mind. Another thing which you might find silly is that I also primed the inside and the bottom of each building. They all have removable ceilings and some of them have windows, so there's no way that I would leave any gray showing. The rest is just me being a little bit OCD perhaps. Time for base coating. For my base coat paint, I went with a custom mix of Tamiya XF20 medium gray and Mr. Color No. 1 gloss white, using an empty glass jar to make it enough for all 4 buildings. I eyeballed the mix until I was happy with the resulting tone, adding more and more white as I went. Then I thinned the paint at around 50% with Mr. Color leveling thinner, and I got ready to spray this at around 20 psi, again with my 0.7 gallery airbrush. As usual, I forgot to press record on the camera, so the first few seconds are missing, but you get the idea. As you can see, my paint mix was rather transparent, which over a dark undercoat inevitably meant that I had to build opacity very gradually. On the other hand, my mix sprayed beautifully, and my trigger airbrush proved amazing for this application, so I just took my time and enjoyed the process. While you see me spray this first building, let me explain my choices a little bit better. The reason I went with this peculiar paint mix is that I had spent hours poring over reference images of the planet Nevarro from Season 1 of Mandalorian, which is what I wanted to replicate. The buildings there had a sort of dirty gray, which I did not think any of my existing paints really emulated well. I didn't want to go with something predominantly white, and I definitely didn't want to paint them in the beige Mos Eisley colors, which almost everyone I've seen online does. The other choice that you might find strange is that I went for gloss white from Mr. Color instead of, say, flat white from Tamiya. Was that a coincidence? No, this was a very deliberate choice for 2 reasons. One, I really thought that the addition of a little bit of gloss would help the base coat look better in the end, and I think it did. And second, I knew from my Sarastus Night project that this particular paint is incredibly tough, actually approaching the hardness of actual automotive paints. Now, I know I'm a bit of a broken record, but durability is important for me, especially for a project where I'm investing literally dozens and dozens of hours. The second building, the tower, was even larger, but I really enjoyed the gradual transformation of applying the base coat to this one. I think that's because it's the very first sort of spherical object that I ever paint. When eventually I started to get some dry tip, the fact that the white in the mix was a lacquer made my life easier. After cleaning the tip and running some thinner through the airbrush, I was able to not only keep spraying again, without any big disruptions, but to simply cover over the speckles from the dried paint, knowing that they would actually dissolve under the subsequent layers of paint. A close inspection proved that the finish was very smooth, and also that all the prep work had really paid off. After all the buildings were base coated in gray, I picked up this Vallejo Premium metallic black paint, and I got ready to paint all the small details like doors or pipes, this time by hand. As you can see, I added some Retarder medium and gave it a good mix before I started to paint with my favorite synthetic brush. While you see me start to block in the metallic paint, I'll tell you a bit more about this particular product, which comes from a Vallejo series of paints which is largely unknown for both scale modelers and wargamers, and yet potentially very useful for both communities. I learned about Vallejo premium paints back in 2020 when I was looking for a metallic paint for the entire exoskeleton of my Warhound Titan. I wanted that model to be absolutely indestructible in terms of the paint coat at least, and after some research I came across this range of paints. As you can see, they are designed for airbrushing, and they create a protective polyurethane layer, same as some of Vallejo's primers. I have deliberately let this paint dry inside one of my paint wells, and I can attest to the veracity of this. Once it cures, you can only peel it like a sticker, but not really clean it, not even with thinner. So anyways, digressions aside, the reason I use it for this is that although it's meant to be airbrushed, this paint is absolutely amazing at giving you practically one coat coverage, which is pretty hard for metallics, particularly over an undercoat other than black. Also, I knew that my goal was making all the metals super rusty, so rather than a very finely pigmented reflective metallic, which this isn't, I needed something which would happily take all the weather and abuse that I would subject it to. And speaking of weather and abuse, It's high time for that, don't you think? So guys, this is the first building, gloss varnished, and reporting for weathering duty. The first step was to apply an enamel wash to all the metallics using a brand new bottle of AK Track Wash, which I thought was the same old product with a new label. Boy, was I wrong. More on this later. As always, I eyeballed the thinning, giving the enamel a good mix with an old brush and testing for consistency. Once I reached eye dilution, which I thought would give me optimal flow, I got my trusty Vinci synthetic brush and I got ready for some good old-fashioned enamel action. As you can see, I wasn't really bothered with precision this time around. This is not like a panel wash or a pin wash in a vehicle, so you just relax and get on with it. By the way, the pipes I painted over with scale 75 old copper prior to this, by hand, and just applied in 2 coats over the previous dark metallic. So, while you see me apply the enamel wash, let's talk about the product itself. Like I said before, this was a brand new bottle of AK Track Wash, and I thought that only the label had changed, but it's clear to me now that this is a new formula. Whereas the Ammo Track Wash and the older AK one were both super heavily pigmented, this was not, and I don't know how to explain it, but I really didn't like the finish at all. Here you can see the results 4 hours after, and I wasn't very impressed. If you can, I recommend you get the Ammo one instead, guys. In any case, I knew that I wanted a very grungy look for all the metals, and in particular for the doors, again based on the Navarro reference pictures that I had studied. My next product of choice, therefore, was Dark Rust Deposits, also by AK, which is an enamel wash with suspended solid pigment particles that dry to create, well, a crusted rust sort of look. This I applied straight out of the bottle, but having stirred and shaken it first. As the idea is to remove excess product later, there is no need for you to try and be precise at this stage. However, if you use this sort of product, make sure to keep the bottle closed and shake it again every few minutes, which I did regularly off camera here. But now for the elephant in the room. You may notice that although nice, I guess, this supposedly dark enamel looks quite pink. Well, guess what? New formula also. I have since checked pictures of models where I use an older bottle of mine, and surely enough, the color used to be completely different, and much better than in this newer one. However, for some reason, as I was applying this, that didn't quite register with me. Like before, I only came to the realization after checking my work once the models were dry. I guess I was just on autopilot. Live to learn, really. Personally, I will not be buying any more AK enamels again, and you can consider this a public service announcement for the rest of you. If you need to know what you're getting, get Ammo of Make instead. If they also start changing their products arbitrarily and without any warning, I'll let you know, guys. Before I address my solution for the so far very disappointing enamel wash stage, let me show you its conclusion. To replicate the buildup of moss or algae on copper pipes, I applied this Moss Deposits product, focusing on raised details. Having let everything dry for about 4 hours, I realized that I wasn't really getting the rust tones that I wanted. But before I continued, it was time for the cleaning up operation. For this I used a makeup sponge, which is perfect for this sort of thing, and does not need any thinner whatsoever, unless you'd let the enamels dry for too long or you forget to varnish your model. As you can see, the effect of the sponges is that some of the excess is removed, but in a much more pleasant and random fashion than if you were using a brush and thinner. Or God forbid, cotton buds. Don't use those. So here was my solution to this disappointing pink finish. Weathering pigments. As always, I sprinkled them onto the model using a makeup brush, and then with another, short bristled one, I stippled them on, repeating the process until I was happy. Once done, I removed some of the excess with a fan brush. Next, I went for light rust, also by Ammo, which I applied more sparingly to the first door. You know the drill. When I checked my work and saw the before and after comparison, with the next door on this building, I was very happy with my choice. This is the way. For the next door, I decided to go heavier on the light rust side, thereby ensuring that they wouldn't look too similar. In any case, pigments are by their very nature random if you apply them like this. But remember, symmetry in weathering is the enemy. The next morning, as I started to try and remove the excess pigments with a brush dampened with thinner, I was kind of horrified to see that I couldn't really do much anymore. Had I waited too long this time? Thankfully, I had the idea to try the makeup sponges again, and voila! A dry sponge over the slightly damp surface did the trick without any problems. If you don't want so much excitement, however, make sure not to leave your pigments dry overnight like I did. Next up, it was time to start creating some shading with my good old Starship wash enamel. No, this is not some disappointing new formula, thank Cthulhu. As usual, I thinned it around 30% with enamel thinner, and I applied the mix carefully with a liner brush, using capillary action, same as I would on a tank or a spaceship. As you can see, this worked really well on parts like that staircase, or on any raised details. Now it was time for streaking effects with another tried and tested product, the oil brushers. Here you can see how I applied the oil paint directly to the model, using its applicator brush and with no dilution. Next, I use a completely dry, flat brush to try and drag the oil paint downwards. After that, I added some more oil paint to reinforce the effect, and I started to work the oils with the brush, which now is very slightly dampened with thinner. As you can see, things start taking shape gradually. The trick to streaking effects is to relax and not even try to get them exactly right on your first pass. I quite often have to hit undo and clean everything to start again. That wasn't the case here, but never be afraid to do that. If you have gloss varnish your model, removing oils immediately after application is never an issue. Enamels can be trickier, because they always tint the surface more, but oils are very forgiving in this regard. Anyway, as you can see, those long and semi-diffuse streaks soon started to look really good. Finally, a step where everything went according to plan. This is Black Umber by Lifecolor, a water-based liquid pigment, yes, you heard correctly, which you're gonna see me apply with my new Gallery Mobius airbrush, which is the first 0.2mm airbrush that I ever own. The last steps in this project all revolve around applying liquid pigments, albeit for a variety of purposes. What I'm doing here is called post-shading, and as you can see, it can reinforce an existing effect, making it more diffuse, or it can create a fake shadow where there was none, increasing contrast. You can also use it to replicate the buildup of dust and grime along the ground, or where it might otherwise accumulate. Here you can see me use it to simulate the steps getting dirty with use. With a detailed airbrush like this, you can also add shading to areas where a pin wash was too weak, as was the case here. But the effect I'm the most proud of is this: subtle and diffuse streaking with the airbrush. Check that out. Having changed to Burnt Umber, also by Lifecolor, I started to block in the areas of damage in the buildings, giving the model some more visual interest, but at a fraction of the time that it would have taken me with other methods, such as regular pigments in powder form. Now, the MAC valve on my Mobius airbrush gave me the idea for the next effect: speckling with liquid pigments. Also known as tippling by airbrush artists, this consists of pushing paint with much less airflow than normal, causing a sort of random splatter pattern. As you can see, the speckling this creates with the liquid pigments is very fine indeed, which can be used to create the impression of accumulated soot, as you can see here on the ceiling of this building. You can also make it directional, as I did here, with a sort of trail of grime leading to the doorway, and another one to the top floor. And of course it can also reinforce existing shading, increasing the realism thanks to its more diffuse nature. All in all, these airbrush techniques involving liquid pigments were the most fun in the entire project, I have to say. So, while we look at some photos of the finished product, let me share some of the lessons that I learned with this project. First of all, you might notice that the buildings have some more contrast than you saw in the last bit of footage. The reason for that is that, following the advice of my buddy Tapio from the Forte Discord, I applied some sponge chipping off camera with a lighter gray after I had already declared the project officially finished. Now the thing is, his advice was entirely sound, but my execution of it really wasn't. I did the sponging in a hurry due to my self-imposed release schedule and without the right paints for the job, because I don't have many acrylics anymore, and long story short, it was a bit of a disaster, which then had me spending hours doing touch-ups here and there. In any case, my goal with this project was not to win any painting contests, but to have a really awesome looking set of terrain for my school's wargaming club, and I'm pretty darn sure that I have met that goal. I can see some flaws here and there, but I can also see some weathering effects that I'm really proud of, and that's what this is about for me. All things considered, there are 3 main lessons I have derived from this project and which I would like to share with you guys. Firstly, I vastly underestimated the time required to get all of this painted. But at the same time though, I would never attempt to speed paint terrain pieces as beautiful as these. There's a tendency among wargamers to treat terrain as some kind of chore that needs to be done before a game. But I would say, instead, we should take inspiration from scale modelers and treat stuff like this like a diorama, which is essentially what I have attempted. My second conclusion has to do with products that can sometimes fail us, like the AK enamel washes in this case, and finding ways around it. Now, I wasn't planning on using pigment powders in this project, but if I hadn't adapted and found that as a solution, I would have ended up with a really disappointing finish. My third conclusion, which might seem contradictory perhaps, is that once you believe a project is well and truly finished, it's often better to, well, leave it alone. Tinkering afterwards, particularly if you're in any kind of hurry, real or imaginary, can lead to frustration. So guys, I hope that you've all enjoyed this video and either learned something new or found some advice or a reminder perhaps that can help you with your own projects. Before I let you go, I would like to thank all of my YouTube members. Your continued support means a lot to me, and your generosity helps keep me stocked with important consumables like those cans of Mr. Surfacer that I use to prepare these FDM prints. I'll be back soon, but in the meantime, remember, keep it up and weather it out.